Sarah Martinez had always been afraid of flying. Even as a commercial pilot with 15 years of experience, the irony wasn't lost on her. She gripped the controls of Flight 447, a Boeing 737 carrying 156 passengers from Denver to Chicago, as turbulence shook the aircraft like a child's toy. The morning had started normally. Sarah arrived at the airport early, completed her pre-flight checks with co-pilot James Wilson, and greeted the cabin crew with her usual smile. Passengers boarded without incident, families heading home from vacation, business travelers rushing to meetings, and elderly couples visiting grandchildren. At 35,000 feet, everything changed in seconds. The first sign of trouble came as a sharp metallic crack echoed through the cockpit. Warning lights began flashing red across the instrument panel. The autopilot disengaged with a loud beep, and the aircraft lurched violently to the right. "What the hell was that?" James shouted, his knuckles white as he grabbed his controls. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She scanned the instruments, her mind racing through emergency procedures she'd practiced countless times in simulators but never experienced in real life. The hydraulic pressure readings were dropping fast. Engine 2 was showing abnormal temperatures. Most terrifying of all, the altitude indicator showed they were losing height rapidly. In the passenger cabin, coffee cups flew through the air. Children began crying. Flight attendant Maria Santos struggled to maintain her balance as she tried to calm frightened passengers. The oxygen masks hadn't deployed yet, but Sarah knew that moment might come soon. Denver Control. "This is Flight 447. We have multiple system failures and are declaring an emergency," Sarah radioed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The response crackled through. "Flight 447, we copy your emergency. What is your situation?" Sarah looked at James, whose face had gone pale. The aircraft was shuddering violently now, fighting against her every command. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the ground growing larger with each passing second. They had maybe 10 minutes before impact. "We're going down," she whispered to herself, then keyed the radio again. "Control, we have complete hydraulic failure and are losing altitude fast. We need immediate vectors to the nearest airport." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah knew the nearest airport was over 100 miles away. At their current rate of descent, they would never make it. Behind her, she could hear the panicked voices of passengers and the calm, professional tones of the flight attendants trying to maintain order. The aircraft bucked again, throwing both pilots against their harnesses. Warning alarms filled the cockpit with their urgent wailing. Sarah had flown through storms, dealt with engine failures, and handled countless emergencies during her career. But nothing had prepared her for this moment when death seemed inevitable. James was frantically going through emergency checklists, but Sarah could see in his eyes that he was reaching the same conclusion she was. The plane was falling out of the sky, and conventional procedures weren't going to save them. That's when something deep inside her shifted. The fear that had always lurked beneath her professional confidence transformed into something else entirely. A calm determination settled over her like a blanket. She thought of her daughter Emma, only 8 years old, waiting for her to come home. She thought of every passenger behind her who trusted her with their lives. "James," she said quietly, her hands steady on the controls for the first time since the crisis began. "Yeah?" he replied, still scanning through emergency procedures. Sarah looked straight ahead at the rapidly approaching terrain, then turned to meet her co-pilot's eyes. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I've got this." The moment those words left Sarah's lips, something changed in the cockpit. James looked at her with a mixture of surprise and relief. He had been flying as a co-pilot for 12 years, but he had never heard that tone of absolute confidence in such a desperate situation. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with newfound purpose. The aircraft was still falling, but she began to understand its behavior. Without hydraulic pressure, the plane was essentially a heavy glider, but it was still responding to some of her inputs. The engines were still running, providing thrust, though Engine 2 was getting hotter by the minute. "Talk to me, Sarah. What are you thinking?" James asked, abandoning his checklist to focus on her. "The hydraulic lines are gone, but we still have engine power. If I can use differential thrust and whatever control surfaces are still working, maybe I can control our descent," she explained. Her voice calmed despite the chaos around them. In the passenger cabin, the situation was becoming more desperate. Flight attendant Maria Santos moved through the aisles, her training taking over as she prepared passengers for a potential crash landing. An elderly man in 14C was having trouble breathing. A mother in row 22 was trying to explain to her 5-year-old son why the plane was shaking so violently. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." Sarah's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "We are experiencing technical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing. Please follow the instructions of your flight attendants and remain calm. We are working to bring everyone home safely." But privately, Sarah knew they were running out of options and time. They had descended from 35,000 feet to 15,000 feet in just 5 minutes. Denver Control was providing vectors to emergency landing sites, but none seemed reachable at their current rate of descent. Then James spotted something through the windscreen. "Sarah, look. 2 o'clock, about 20 miles out. That's Morrison Field." Sarah followed his gaze. Morrison Field was a small regional airport, built during World War II and now used mainly for private aircraft and flight training. The runway was shorter than what a Boeing 737 typically needed, but it was their best option. "Morrison Field, this is Flight 447. We are a Boeing 737 with 156 souls on board experiencing complete hydraulic failure. Request emergency landing," Sarah radioed. The response came quickly. "Flight 447 Morrison Field. Our runway is only 4,800 feet long. Can you make that work?" Sarah did quick calculations in her head. A normal landing required about 6,000 feet. With no hydraulics, no spoilers, and limited braking capability, she would need to bring the aircraft down at the perfect speed and angle. Too fast and they would overshoot the runway. Too slow, and they would crash short of it. "We'll make it work," she replied. James was studying the approach charts for Morrison Field. "Sarah, there's something else. There's a housing development right at the end of the runway. If we overshoot..." Sarah understood immediately. If they came in too hot and couldn't stop on the short runway, they would plow directly into a residential neighborhood. Families would be home having lunch, children playing in yards, people going about their normal Saturday routines with no idea that a crippled airliner might crash into their lives. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders. It wasn't just 156 lives in her hands anymore. It was potentially hundreds more on the ground. "Morrison Field. We're going to need you to foam the runway and have emergency crews standing by," Sarah requested. "Already in progress. Flight 447. Fire trucks are rolling now." Sarah began setting up for the most challenging approach of her career. She would have to use engine power alone to control their descent, timing everything perfectly to arrive at the runway at exactly the right speed and altitude. There would be no second chances, no go-around if the approach went wrong. As they descended through 8,000 feet, the aircraft hit another violent patch of turbulence. Several passengers screamed. In the galley, flight attendant David Chen was securing loose items when a coffee pot broke free and struck him in the head, opening a cut above his eye. 6 minutes to touchdown, James announced, his voice tight with tension. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was racing through every possible scenario. She thought about her flight instructor from 20 years ago, Captain Robert Hayes, who had taught her that flying was about more than just following procedures. Sometimes, he had said, you had to trust your instincts and feel what the aircraft was telling you. Right now, the aircraft was telling her it wanted to fall out of the sky. But Sarah Martinez was not ready to let that happen. As Flight 447 descended through 5,000 feet, Sarah could see Morrison Field clearly now. The small airport looked impossibly tiny compared to the massive commercial airports she was used to. Emergency vehicles were already positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights flashing like deadly Christmas decorations. Sarah, Engine 2 temperature is redlining, James warned, his eyes fixed on the instrument panel. We might lose it completely. Sarah nodded grimly. Losing an engine would make an already impossible landing even more challenging. She would have to compensate for the uneven thrust, fighting to keep the aircraft straight during the approach. In the cabin, flight attendants were moving through final preparations. Maria Santos knelt beside elderly passenger Harold Chen in 14C, who was struggling with chest pains brought on by the stress and thin air. His wife Eleanor held his hand tightly, whispering prayers in Mandarin. Sir, I need you to put your head down and brace for landing, Maria instructed gently. We're going to get through this. 3 rows back, Jennifer Walsh was trying to explain to her twin 5-year-olds why everyone was acting scared. Remember the emergency position we practiced? she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. We're going to play that game now. But Jennifer's calm facade was cracking. She had heard the tone in the pilot's voice, seen the fear in the flight attendants' eyes despite their professional smiles. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a text message to her husband. Tell the kids I love them. Something wrong with plane. Pray for us. Back in the cockpit, Sarah was fighting the aircraft every second. Without hydraulics, the controls felt like she was trying to steer a car with no power steering while driving through mud. Every adjustment required enormous physical effort, and sweat was dripping down her face despite the cool air conditioning. 3,000 feet, James called out. Morrison Field, Flight 447 is on final approach. Roger, Flight 447. Wind is calm, runway clear. Emergency crews standing by. Sarah could see people gathering outside the airport terminal, cell phones raised to capture what might be either a miraculous landing or a terrible tragedy. She forced herself to block out everything except the aircraft and the runway ahead. Gear down, she ordered. James moved the landing gear lever, but the usual green lights indicating the gear was locked down didn't appear. No gear indication, Sarah. The hydraulic system controls the gear locks. This was getting worse by the minute. Not only did they have no flight controls and a failing engine, but now they couldn't be sure if their landing gear was properly extended. Landing on partially deployed gear could cause the aircraft to cartwheel and explode. We'll have to assume it's down, Sarah decided. There was no time for alternatives. At 2,000 feet, Engine 2 finally gave up. A loud bang echoed through the aircraft as the engine seized, followed by an eerie silence on the right side. The plane immediately began yawing to the left as the remaining engine pushed them off course. Sarah fought the controls, using full right rudder and adjusting thrust on the remaining engine to keep them aligned with the runway. The physical effort was enormous, and she could feel her arms beginning to shake from the strain. 1,000 feet, James announced. Sarah, you're doing amazing. Just hold it steady. But steady was relative. The aircraft was wallowing through the air like a wounded bird, dropping faster than Sarah wanted and drifting left and right, despite her best efforts. Through the windscreen, she could see the runway approaching fast, perhaps too fast. In the cabin, passengers had assumed the brace position. Some were praying aloud, others sat in terrified silence. Flight attendant David Chen, blood still trickling from the cut on his forehead, was making final safety announcements with a calm voice that belied the terror in his eyes. Brace for impact.
Heads down!
Brace for impact. At 500 feet, Sarah knew they were coming in too fast and too steep. A normal approach speed for a Boeing 737 was around 140 knots. They were approaching at nearly 180 knots with no way to slow down further without losing lift and crashing short of the runway. Sarah, James said quietly, if we hit that housing development. We won't, she replied with absolute certainty, though she wasn't sure where that confidence was coming from. At 200 feet, Sarah could see individual houses beyond the end of the runway, children's bicycles and driveways. A man mowing his lawn, completely unaware that a crippled airliner was about to attempt a landing just a few hundred yards away. The aircraft was still dropping too fast. Sarah pulled back on the controls with all her strength, trying to flatten the descent. The plane responded sluggishly, fighting her every input. 100 feet, James called. 50 feet, Sarah. The runway rushed up to meet them. Sarah held her breath, pulled back on the controls one final time, and whispered a prayer to every deity she could think of. Here we go. The Boeing 737 hit the runway with tremendous force. The impact sent shock waves through every passenger's body as the aircraft bounced once, twice, then slammed down hard on the tarmac. The sound was deafening, like a building collapsing mixed with the screech of tortured metal. Sarah felt the controls go completely dead in her hands. With no hydraulics and limited braking, the aircraft was now essentially a 150,000-pound missile racing down a runway that was far too short. The speedometer showed they were still doing 140 knots with less than 3,000 feet of runway remaining. Reverse thrust on engine 1, she shouted to James. James moved the thrust lever, and the remaining engine roared as it attempted to slow their forward momentum. But with only one engine providing reverse thrust, the aircraft began to veer sharply to the right, heading directly toward the emergency vehicles lined up beside the runway. Sarah fought the controls, using every ounce of strength she had left to keep them straight. Her arms felt like they were on fire from the effort. In the cabin, Passengers who had loosened their seatbelts after the initial touchdown were thrown forward as Sarah applied what little braking power they had. Elderly Harold Chen, already weakened by chest pains, was flung from his seat, despite his wife Eleanor's attempts to hold him. He crashed into the seat in front of him with a sickening thud. Maria Santos, still standing in the aisle trying to help passengers, was thrown to the floor as the aircraft lurched violently. 2,000 feet of runway left. James called out, his voice barely audible over the noise. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the end of the runway approaching fast. Beyond it was a small ditch, then a chain-link fence, and then the housing development. She could see a woman hanging laundry in her backyard, still unaware of the drama unfolding just yards away. The aircraft was still moving too fast. At their current speed, they would shoot off the end of the runway and plow directly into those houses. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct and every procedure she had ever learned. She deliberately steered the aircraft toward the right side of the runway, aiming for a grassy area beside the tarmac. If she could get the landing gear into the soft ground, it might create enough drag to stop them before they reached the houses. "Sarah, what are you doing?" James shouted. "Trust me," she replied, yanking the controls hard right. The right main landing gear left the paved runway and dug into the soft earth beside it. Immediately, the aircraft began to slow as dirt and grass sprayed up past the windows. But the maneuver also caused the plane to start spinning in a slow, sickening circle. In the cabin, passengers screamed as they felt the aircraft rotating. Jennifer Walsh pulled her twin boys against her chest, certain these would be their final moments. Flight attendant David Chen, still bleeding from his head injury, braced himself against a seatback as the aircraft spun. The spinning motion was actually helping to bleed off speed, but it was also threatening to flip the aircraft over. Sarah could feel they were balancing on the edge between a successful emergency landing and a catastrophic crash. 1,000 feet, James yelled. The aircraft was still spinning and sliding sideways now, carving a deep furrow in the grass beside the runway. Sarah could see emergency vehicles racing to follow their path, red lights flashing through the dust cloud they were creating. 500 feet from the houses, the aircraft hit a small drainage ditch that ran parallel to the runway. The impact sent another violent shock through the plane, but it also had the effect of straightening them out and slowing them even further. 300 feet. 200 feet. Sarah could now see individual windows in the houses ahead. In one window, a child was pressed against the glass, watching the approaching aircraft with wide eyes. A man in his driveway had dropped his garden hose and was running toward his house, shouting something Sarah couldn't hear. 100 feet. The aircraft was still moving, but much slower now. Sarah applied everything she had left, pulling back on the controls, using the last of their reverse thrust, even pressing on brake pedals she knew weren't working. 50 feet from the chain-link fence that marked the edge of the housing development, Flight 447 finally came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Sarah and James sat frozen, hardly believing they were still alive. Behind them, the passenger cabin was filled with the sounds of crying, praying, and the groans of injured passengers. Then James reached over and put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." But Sarah wasn't celebrating yet. She could smell smoke, and she knew that with all the stress they had put on the aircraft systems, fire was a real possibility. They needed to evacuate everyone immediately. "James, start the evacuation procedure. Get everyone off this plane now." As James began coordinating with the flight attendants, Sarah keyed her radio one more time. "Morrison Field, Flight 447 is down safely. We need medical assistance for several passengers and immediate fire support. All souls on board are alive." The response came back immediately, filled with relief and amazement. "Flight 447, that was the most incredible piece of flying any of us have ever seen. Emergency crews are already rolling to your position." Sarah slumped back in her seat, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Through the windscreen, she could see the woman who had been hanging laundry now standing at her fence, staring at the massive aircraft that had come to rest just yards from her home. They had made it. Against all odds, through equipment failure, engine loss, and a runway far too short for their aircraft, they had somehow brought 156 people home alive. The evacuation of Flight 447 began immediately. Emergency slides deployed from the aircraft's doors as firefighters sprayed foam around the plane to prevent any potential fires. The acrid smell of hot metal and burnt rubber filled the air, but there were no flames. Sarah remained in the cockpit for several precious minutes, going through post-landing procedures, even though most of her instruments were dead. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely flip the switches, but she needed to secure the aircraft before leaving. Years of training had ingrained these procedures so deeply that she followed them even in this extraordinary situation. Meanwhile, the passenger cabin had transformed into organized chaos. Flight attendant Maria Santos, despite being bruised and shaken, was helping passengers down the emergency slides. Her professional smile had returned, though tears of relief streamed down her face. "Move toward the exits quickly, but don't run," she instructed. "Leave all personal belongings. We'll worry about your bags later." Jennifer Walsh emerged from the aircraft carrying both her 5-year-old twins, who were crying, but uninjured. As she reached the bottom of the slide, her legs gave out and she collapsed on the grass, clutching her children and sobbing. A paramedic rushed over to check them for injuries. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Jennifer managed between sobs. "We're alive. We're actually alive." The most seriously injured passenger was elderly Harold Chen, who had suffered a mild heart attack during the landing sequence. Paramedics worked on him immediately while his wife Eleanor held his hand and spoke to him in gentle Mandarin. Despite his condition, Harold was conscious and squeezing his wife's hand back. Flight attendant David Chen, no relation to the passenger, was also receiving medical attention for the head injury he had sustained when the coffee pot struck him. As paramedics cleaned and bandaged the wound, he kept looking back at the aircraft. "I can't believe we walked away from that," he told the paramedic. "I've been flying for 8 years and I've never seen anything like what Captain Martinez did in there." As the last passengers were evacuated, James finally convinced Sarah to leave the cockpit. Her legs were unsteady as she made her way through the empty cabin. Taking in the scattered debris, dropped oxygen masks, and overturned food carts that told the story of their desperate descent. When Sarah emerged from the aircraft, she was greeted by a small crowd of passengers who had refused to leave until they could thank her personally. Among them was Jennifer Walsh, still holding her twins. "Captain," Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my babies' lives." Sarah looked down at the 2 5-year-old boys who were now smiling despite their earlier tears. She knelt down to their eye level. "You boys were very brave today," she said softly. "I'm proud of you for listening to your mom and following instructions." One of the twins, Tommy, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are you a superhero?" he asked. Sarah laughed for the first time since the crisis began. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a pilot who had a really good co-pilot and a lot of luck." But the gathered passengers disagreed. Word was already spreading about what had happened in the sky above Morrison Field. Airport workers who had witnessed the landing were calling it impossible. The fire chief, a veteran of 30 years who had seen countless emergency landings, told reporters it was the most skillful piece of flying he had ever witnessed. As Sarah walked across the grass toward the terminal building, she was approached by a man in his 60s wearing a pilot's uniform. She recognized him immediately as Captain Robert Hayes, her old flight instructor who now worked at Morrison Field training new pilots. "Sarah Martinez," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I should have known. When they told me the pilot's name over the radio, I thought it sounded familiar." "Captain Hayes," Sarah replied, suddenly feeling like a student pilot again. "What are you doing here?" "I work here now, training the next generation, and apparently watching my former students perform miracles." He gestured toward the aircraft behind them. "That was textbook emergency flying, Sarah. Except they don't have textbooks for what you just did because it's supposed to be impossible." Sarah looked back at Flight 447, sitting in the grass beside the runway with emergency vehicles surrounding it. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful, like it had simply chosen an unusual place to park. "I just did what you taught me," she said. "Feel what the aircraft is telling you and trust your instincts." "I taught you basic emergency procedures," Hayes replied. "What you did up there was pure instinct and skill. You saved 156 lives today with a dead aircraft. That's not something they teach in flight school." As they talked, news crews were already arriving at Morrison Field. The story of Flight 447's impossible landing was spreading rapidly. Social media was filled with videos shot by witnesses, showing the crippled aircraft's dramatic approach and landing. But Sarah wasn't thinking about fame or recognition. She was thinking about her 8-year-old daughter Emma, who would be getting out of school soon. Sarah pulled out her phone and called her sister Maria, who watched Emma on Saturdays. Maria, it's me. Is Emma there? Sarah! Oh my God, we just saw the news. Are you okay? They're saying you... I'm fine, Sarah interrupted. Can I talk to Emma? A moment later, her daughter's voice came on the line, excited and confused. Mommy, they're saying on TV that you landed a broken airplane. Is that true? Sarah felt tears coming for the first time since the crisis began. Yes, baby, it's true. Mommy's airplane had some problems, but we fixed it and everyone is safe. Are you still coming home for dinner? I'll be there, Sarah promised. I might be a little late, but I'll be there. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that this was what mattered most. Not the impossible landing, not the praise from colleagues, but the simple promise to come home to her daughter. It was a promise she had almost been unable to keep. The investigation into Flight 447's emergency landing began within hours. Federal Aviation Administration inspectors arrived at Morrison Field, along with representatives from Boeing and the engine manufacturer. The aircraft sat in the grass like a sleeping giant, surrounded by investigators taking photographs and measurements. Sarah spent the next 6 hours being debriefed by accident investigators, describing every detail of the flight from takeoff to the final moments when the aircraft came to rest. She answered hundreds of questions about her decisions, the aircraft's behavior, and the sequence of system failures. Captain Martinez, said lead investigator Dr. Patricia Hawkins, in my 23 years investigating aircraft accidents, I have never seen a case where a pilot successfully landed a commercial aircraft with complete hydraulic failure, using only engine power and manual controls. What you accomplished should be physically impossible. Sarah sat in the conference room at Morrison Field's administration building, still wearing her pilot's uniform, which was now wrinkled and stained with sweat. Dr. Hawkins, I just flew the airplane. I used everything my experience taught me and trusted that the aircraft wanted to land safely. But your decision to deliberately leave the runway and use the grass to create drag, Dr. Hawkins continued, that's not in any emergency procedures manual. Where did that idea come from? Sarah thought for a moment. I could see we weren't going to stop on the runway. I knew there were houses beyond the airport. I had to find a way to slow us down without killing people on the ground. The soft earth seemed like the only option. James Wilson, who had been in the debriefing session alongside Sarah, added his perspective. I've flown with a lot of pilots, but I've never seen anyone stay that calm under that kind of pressure. When Captain Martinez said, "I've got this," something changed in the cockpit. I knew we were going to make it. While the investigation continued, the story of Flight 447 was making headlines around the world. News channels were calling it the miracle at Morrison Field and the landing that defied physics. Aviation experts were appearing on television, trying to explain how Sarah had accomplished what many considered impossible. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, famous for his own emergency landing on the Hudson River years earlier, released a statement praising Sarah's skill and decision-making. What Captain Martinez accomplished demonstrates the highest levels of airmanship and proves that proper training, combined with exceptional skill and courage, can overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. But not everyone was ready to call it a miracle. Initial reports suggested that a catastrophic failure in the hydraulic system had been caused by metal fatigue in a critical component. The airline faced questions about maintenance procedures and inspection schedules. Lawyers were already preparing lawsuits on behalf of passengers who had been injured during the emergency landing. Sarah tried to stay away from the media attention, but it was impossible to avoid completely. When she finally arrived home that evening, 12 hours later than planned, news vans were parked outside her house. Neighbors had gathered on the street and Emma came running out the front door despite the crowd of reporters. "Mommy!" Emma threw herself into Sarah's arms, nearly knocking her over. "I saw you on TV. Everyone at school is saying my mom is a hero." Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of her small body. This was real. This was what mattered, not the cameras or the reporters or the investigation. "I'm not a hero, baby," Sarah said softly. "I just did my job." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. She had done far more than her job that day. She had reached beyond her training, beyond procedures, beyond what anyone thought was possible. Inside the house, Sarah's sister Maria had prepared dinner and was waiting with tears in her eyes. The two women embraced without words, both understanding how close they had come to a very different outcome. Over dinner, Emma chattered excitedly about her day at school and how all her friends were impressed that her mother was on television. Sarah listened, trying to focus on normal life, but part of her mind kept replaying those terrifying minutes in the cockpit. "Mom," Emma said suddenly, "were you scared?" Sarah considered lying, giving her daughter a brave answer that would maintain the illusion of parental invincibility. But something about the day's events had changed her perspective on truth and vulnerability. "Yes, sweetheart, I was scared. Very scared. But sometimes being scared doesn't mean you can't do what needs to be done. It just means you have to be extra careful and use everything you know." "So being scared is okay?" "Being scared is normal," Sarah replied. "What matters is what you do when you're scared." Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat in her living room and finally allowed herself to process what had happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. She thought about the passengers, wondering how they were coping with their own trauma from the experience. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, aviation magazines, and even Hollywood agents interested in the movie rights to her story. But the call that mattered most came at 10 p.m. from Harold Chen's wife, Eleanor. "Captain Martinez, this is Eleanor Chen. My husband Harold was the elderly passenger in seat 14C. Sarah remembered immediately. "Mrs. Chen, how is Harold? I heard he was taken to the hospital. He's stable now, thanks to you. The doctors say the stress of the landing triggered his heart attack, but if the plane had crashed..." Eleanor's voice broke. "Captain, Harold and I have been married for 52 years. We were flying to Chicago to see our new granddaughter for the first time. Because of you, Harold will get to hold her." After Eleanor hung up, Sarah sat in the quiet darkness of her living room and finally cried, not from fear or stress, but from overwhelming gratitude. She had kept her promise to bring everyone home. All 156 souls on board Flight 447 had walked away from an aircraft that by all rights should have crashed. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more investigations, and more media attention. But tonight, Sarah was simply a mother who had made it home for dinner, even if it was 12 hours late. 6 months after the emergency landing at Morrison Field, the final investigation report was released. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that a manufacturing defect in a hydraulic valve, combined with unusual metal fatigue, had caused the catastrophic failure of all 3 hydraulic systems simultaneously, an event so rare it had never been recorded in commercial aviation history. The report praised Sarah Martinez's exceptional airmanship, quick thinking, and innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure. It noted that her decision to use differential, engine thrust for control, and to deliberately leave the runway to create drag had saved not only the lives of everyone on board, but potentially dozens of people in the nearby housing development. Boeing announced that all aircraft of that model would receive enhanced inspections of the hydraulic system components. The airline faced millions in settlements but also received praise for its pilot training programs that had prepared Sarah for such an unprecedented emergency. For Sarah, life had changed dramatically. She was invited to speak at aviation conferences around the world, sharing her experience and the lessons learned from Flight 447. Airlines sought her expertise in developing new emergency procedures. Universities offered her teaching positions. Hollywood producers continued to call about movie deals. But Sarah chose to keep flying commercial aircraft. She was assigned to a new Boeing 777, and though she was initially nervous about returning to the cockpit, she found that her love of flying had not diminished. If anything, her experience with Flight 447 had deepened her respect for aviation and her commitment to safety. James Wilson remained her co-pilot by choice. The two had developed an unbreakable bond during those terrifying minutes, and James often said he felt safer flying with Sarah than any other pilot he knew. "She's already proved she can land anything under any conditions," he would joke to other crew members. "What are the odds of having 2 impossible emergencies in one career?" The passengers of Flight 447 stayed in touch through a Facebook group that Jennifer Walsh had created. They called themselves the Morrison Field Survivors and met annually on the anniversary of the landing. Many credited the experience with changing their perspectives on life, leading them to pursue dreams they had previously postponed or to reconcile with family members they had been estranged from. Harold Chen, the elderly passenger who had suffered a heart attack during the landing, made a full recovery and did indeed get to hold his new granddaughter. He and Eleanor sent Sarah a photo every month showing their growing family. Harold often said that Sarah had given him not just his life back, but years of precious time with his children and grandchildren. Emma Martinez, now 9 years old, had become something of a celebrity at her school. She handled the attention with remarkable maturity, often telling classmates that while she was proud of her mother, she was more proud that Sarah came home every day and helped with homework and made pancakes on Sunday mornings. On the first anniversary of Flight 447, Sarah was invited to Morrison Field for a memorial ceremony. The small airport had erected a plaque commemorating the emergency landing, and the grass area where the aircraft had finally come to rest was marked with a small monument. Standing in the same spot where she had emerged from the aircraft a year earlier, Sarah was approached by Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the lead accident investigator. "Captain Martinez, I wanted you to know that your case study is now taught at every major aviation school in the country. Student pilots learn about differential thrust control using your techniques. I hope they never have to use them," Sarah replied. "So do I. But if they do, they'll be better prepared because of what you accomplished here." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah walked over to the chain-link fence that marked the edge of the housing development. The woman who had been hanging laundry that day, Margaret Foster, was waiting there with her family. "Captain Martinez, we've wanted to meet you for a year," Margaret said. "You probably don't remember, but this is my house." She pointed to the backyard where she had been hanging clothes when Flight 447 came to rest just yards away. "I remember," Sarah said. "I could see you in your yard during the final seconds. I was determined not to let our emergency become your tragedy." Margaret's teenage son stepped forward. "Ma'am, I was in my bedroom when I heard the plane. I looked out my window and saw you fighting to control it. I've never seen anything braver in my life." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she had been just another commercial pilot, competent but unknown outside her profession. A mechanical failure that should have killed 156 people had instead transformed her into a symbol of skill, courage, and the triumph of human determination over seemingly impossible odds. But the real victory, she knew, wasn't the awards or recognition. It was Emma's laughter as they played board games after dinner. It was the Christmas cards from passengers like the Chen family. It was the knowledge that she had kept her promise to bring everyone home. Sarah Martinez had always been afraid of flying, even as a pilot. That fear hadn't disappeared after Flight 447, but it had evolved into something else. A profound respect for the responsibility she carried every time she sat in a cockpit. She was entrusted with the lives of hundreds of people with families and dreams and futures they wanted to reach. When she climbed into the pilot seat of her Boeing 777 for her next scheduled flight to Los Angeles, Sarah performed her pre-flight checks with the same meticulous care she always had. But now she also whispered a small prayer, not for her own safety, but for the ability to continue earning the trust that passengers placed in her every time they stepped aboard her aircraft. As the 777 lifted off into the evening sky, Sarah Martinez looked out at the lights of the city below and smiled. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And if another impossible situation ever arose, she knew exactly what she would whisper to herself: "I've got this."